Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hi, and welcome to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm Marie Stella, your host from Melbourne, Australia. Let's start the show. Welcome back to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast. I'm your host, Marie, and in today's episode, we are exploring relationships that find their start between screens. In the age of swipes and likes, the mobile phone is now very much a viable option for finding love and connection, but there's still this stigma that persists. So today we're picking the brain of psychotherapist and digital nomad Minh Trần to unravel a bit of that mystery behind digital dating, deconstruct some of that stigma, and potentially even get some tips on creating an authentic profile. Hi, Min. Lovely having you on the show. How are you going?
Hi. It's nice to be here. I'm excited to
Yeah, it's lovely to have
start.
you here. Yeah. So what is the biggest misconception that you've heard about dating apps?
It's so hard to choose the biggest, but if I had to, I would say it's something like, actually, it's something that you had brought up in one of our offline conversations, where the safety issue, I think that probably the most common misconception is that somehow dating apps are less safe than meeting people in person at a bar or a club or at the grocery store or the spa or whatever. And I don't think that to be true. I don't think you think that either, of course. And so would you like to kind of speak a little bit on that subject yourself?
Oh, yeah, sure. I was actually going to touch on it later, but I just think that dating apps just provide this almost like a digital footprint for whomever you're going to meet, compared to like if you were to meet a stranger at a bar, or if you were to meet someone completely random at what have you recreational events, where you don't really know anything about this person either. But at least if you're meeting through a dating app, they leave this digital footprint behind, and you're able to do something like screenshots or report, and maybe like it might not be taken like as seriously as it should, but at least there's something there, that there's kind of like some, I don't want to say leverage, but there is something there you can do, that it feels like there's more you can grasp onto. What do you think?
Well, I think the misconception comes from phenomenon like catfishing, if you have heard of that. And just to define it for the audience, it's as I understand it, it's when people pretend to be somebody else for the purpose of, getting money from you or something along those lines. And that does exist. That, I've heard stories, and it is out there. And in my practice, that's something. Well, actually, personally, my clients don't really. You can tell, there's certain ways to tell, but and maybe we can touch on that later on today. But that's something that does exist out there in the world. But in terms of safety, for the most part, you're right. Like, I mean, there's this digital footprint that you're talking about, and also oftentimes in smaller communities, let's say in the gay male community, for instance, a lot of people might be hitting up the same person, you know what I mean, or like be checking out somebody similar. So there's that kind of checks and balances aspect of it too. And also that apps, as they have come to be more recently, because I do think that they are a form of social media, essentially, like a LinkedIn or an Instagram. There is a kind of conscientiousness that I have found that the apps themselves are picking up on too. such as, maybe you can touch on this more specifically later as well, which is things like sending nude pictures, in these apps. They block that now in the app functions themselves. You can't like screenshot it anymore. Things like that, for instance. So I think that's a bit. So I think it's a big misconception. Glad that we got that out of the way in the beginning.
Yeah, I agree. I've definitely seen on dating apps more recently that if they sense or they screen, they tend to screen your messages now, and it's not really because they are trying to intrude on your privacy, but it's more of they screen the messages with their AI or what have you, and if they sense that there is some inappropriate language or behavior going on in the messages, they'll ask you are you finding this person's behavior inappropriate? And then you're able to report it from there on. So I do see those features coming out more recently as well. And that's an incredible introduction to what we're talking about today. But before we get further into detail, we'd love to get to know you better. So this is, have you met Min? And my first question for you is, as a digital nomad, which is very interesting life to lead, where have been your favorite spots to visit and live?
Well, I've only started the digital nomad life just this year, but in terms of my travels and things, and I like to travel. It's definitely one of my hobbies. Machu Picchu, I think I would have to give the most beautiful in Peru. And Mexico City, I mean, I love south of the border here. Mexico City for urban fun, sophistication, but also affordability. And Vietnam, all of Vietnam, just for soulfulness. I'm Vietnamese, and so that's always a deeper connection with the motherland.
Yeah.
So those are my three top.
Yeah, that's a good range to have, I feel like. I often speak to people who do travel a lot, and they tend to have one thing that they really like beaches, and I'm only going here for beaches, and I like to stay close to the beach. But it's nice, it's really refreshing to hear such a good range of places that you like to spend your time. So what kind of activities do you enjoy doing when you're traveling?
Well, I'm a vegetarian for the most part, but when I travel, especially, I'll break my veg and I'll try whatever delicacy of the place, whatever the locals eat. I'll try to do that, and so definitely, eating is some of my favorite. And honestly, I don't do this so much anymore in my 30s, but definitely in my 20s, I would definitely be on the apps, on the dating apps, and seeing who's around, checking out the locals that way too.
Yeah.
And I can speak, in the gay male community, for instance, it's a way of meeting friends too. I've met lots of great friends through dating apps. So there's that. So meeting new people 100%. When I travel.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like it's even more vital if you're traveling and not knowing anyone around to meet more new people. Meet more new people. I had my own phase of meeting new people, going on dates, not necessarily going on dates in hopes of getting into a long-term relationship or anything particularly serious, but you meet so many different characters, just from going on these dates that might just be casual, that you just naturally have your eyes opened and get your your opinions just naturally kind of open up a bit, which is always very interesting. So you mentioned before that you're vegetarian. If you had to pick, what cuisine would you eat for the rest of your life?
Well, when I read that question you sent me ahead of time, it was easy. I mean, Vietnamese cuisine, of course. I think it meets all my needs, and it also is it's very vegetarian friendly as well too, and it's relatively healthy. So Vietnamese.
Yeah. What Vietnamese dishes do you find yourself gravitating to the most often?
That's easy. Spring rolls. It's easy to just throw something in a rice paper, wrap it up. It's like a salad basically in rice paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, my Vietnamese friend also showed me something where they did like a hot pot and everyone had like rice paper rolls and you just put whatever was in the hot pot into your rice paper roll and roll it up and you just eat it.
Ooh,
And
yum.
that was really fun and
Yeah.
so
You
easy to
participated?
do.
You participated? Okay.
Yeah, I participated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So aside from traveling, eating, meeting new people, what are some of your favorite hobbies?
Mm, I love attending music festivals. It's probably like the favorite thing in the world for me. If I knew
Yeah.
I'd die in like 72 hours or something, I'd be at a music festival right now. So we're talking to you, sorry. But I, but I mean, in terms of like things that aren't my day job, I was a theater kid, so singing, acting, dancing was always my thing. And actually, I'm now able to incorporate theater into my conference presentation. So it's something I'm kind of doing to make a little splash in the field, in my field right now, is like
Oh,
doing musical
wow.
lectures. Yeah,
Yeah, that is really, really cool.
thanks.
Do you have, is there a musical in your life that you watched and it inspired you so much from then on?
Oh gosh. Hmm. Well, I'm not. It's a TV musical. I mean, Moulin Rouge was a good
Hmm.
one from back in the day. I
Hmm.
thought it was just so fabulous and like out there and strange and broke a lot of narrative structures too. Kind of thinking back
Yeah.
at it, but it also is still like entertaining and
Yeah.
fun. Yeah, Moulin
Yeah,
Rouge.
absolutely. Yeah. So my last question for you before we end off this section is who do you look up to the most in your life?
Well, speaking of Moulin Rouge, actually, when I was a teenager, I was really, my idol was Christina Aguilera. And it was because she was really like, like in terms of like with her peers, she definitely, her music at the time with the stripped album was deeper and
Yeah.
realer. And there was this empowerment of like sexuality and queerness. So she was my teen idol. In terms of my adult, who I look up to in my career now, Carl Jung and Irvin Yalom are two people that I look up to for their psychiatric careers. I mean, they're very well known, but also they still see, Irvin Yalom is still alive, of course, but they Jung saw patients till the very end. And Irvin Yalom, who's in his 80s now, is, adopting telehealth and talking about it and lecturing about it, which is super cool to have somebody who's a founder of the field,
Yeah.
like continue to like grow. Um,
Yeah.
and I have to add that spiritually, I I grew up Buddhist, but it was always like I'd always admired the story of Yeshua of Nazareth, so Jesus. There was always
Yeah.
something about it that was so moving to me, and
Mhm.
definitely somebody to look up to, somebody to like model
Mhm.
your life after. Somebody who could
Mhm.
like hang out with like thieves and prostitutes and tell people to have compassion for them. I mean, how cool is that?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I also heard in some stories that Yeshua or Jesus or something like that. Well, he was hanging out with prostitutes and um lepers and all that stuff, but he was shunned for it, which is really interesting to think about. And yeah, it really does. Well, you might not necessarily spiritually follow that religion, but you kind of take cues from the character and kind of incorporate those traits into your life, I suppose. So that's always something interesting to talk about. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing that with us. I feel like we got to know you a bit better, and yeah, just so much to know about you, and that was incredible. But we're moving on to the interview section, and I can't wait to just dive right into this because I feel like there's so much that we want to talk about with this. But my first question for you is how would you define a relationship?
What I tell my clients often is like a good rule of thumb is relationships boil it down to relating when in doubt. So it takes a you there, a me here, a gap between us, and then how we occupy that gap, right? The ethics of the engagement, the boundaries that we negotiate. And And I mean, certainly I think when it comes to romantic relationships, there are things like caretaking and some caretaking involved and needs and mutuality and attraction and all of that stuff too. But a relationship is really, it's about relating, connecting over something or not, or figuring out that you can't. And like, how do you navigate that too?
Oh yeah, 100%. And in your opinion, does a relationship still hold the same meaning, structure, and importance as, let's say, decades ago?
I'm not sure what do you mean by decades ago. If it's like maybe within my lifetime, when 2 decades ago or something, as when I was a teenager, doesn't seem like a whole lot has changed. I would say something like people might be more open-minded of the structures of their relationship, open relationships. Polyamory was a big thing when I was living in Denver for a few years. I'd come to like realize, as I didn't realize before. And I think as a therapist, and this, I don't know how true this is, but just as a therapist and in my paralleling my evolution as a person, there's something about people I seem to be coming more into consciousness of what I'm going to call, and people might not use this term, but the spiritual dimension of romantic relationships, especially because there's so much that's involved. I mean, it like from the lowest to the highest, right? Like it really brings out our shadow sides. People can really get nasty and nasty in a way that they won't be nasty to anybody else. And, the highest of highs, and like, you reach for the stars and it's a transformative experience. We take each other to another level kind of thing. So there's a spiritual dimension to it that we're, I think, coming into more awareness as a collective, as people.
Yeah. It's really interesting because when you're describing the highs of the highs, the lows of the lows, and how like some people can bring out the nastiest in you, or some people can be nasty to you in ways that they won't be to other people. And it reminds me a lot of like the yin and yang of like, in every in like where there's majority of good or light, there's a bit of darkness, and where there's majority of darkness, there's always a bit of light. And people, especially when talking about relationships, no like relationship is perfect, right? And then so people are complex, and people naturally, like, there's no perfect person. Everyone's going to have some kind of fault or flaw, and you naturally learn these things about people through relationships.
I would point that out towards ourselves too. Everything you just said, but also like towards ourselves. I can be really nasty in our relationship, in a way that I wouldn't allow myself in another context. And projections. And I think what you were on to is the concept of projection. We project in relationships.
Yeah. So what do you think dating apps has added to the realm of dating?
Well, to kind of bridge what we were just talking about, I think there could be a lot more projection in the realm of the dating app. So if you find that you're already in love with a person and you haven't even met yet, then there's probably a lot of like projection of something going on there, of your internal world that's being projected out into the external. But I think on the better side of things, dating apps have opened for the introverts and the shy, I think, a way to explore. Kind of dipping your toes in the waters and putting yourself out there in a way that you might not feel comfortable to otherwise, in an in-person context. Of course, that can swing to like an extreme too. But I think for the smaller, like LGBTQ plus communities, for instance, it really is an easy way to find connection and like mutuality and mates.
Yeah, for sure. And so what are some other motivations behind people using dating apps rather than meeting new people in person, do you think?
Well, I can actually, recently I just downloaded some apps myself. It's been a little while, but I think if convenience, you were mentioning like everything kind of in the phone, on the palm of your hand. Yeah. So there's a big convenience kind of factor. I think there's also, we were just talking about like specific communities. And so beyond the LGBTQ communities, there could be, BDSM, for instance, or bears, or, exclusively lesbians, or whatever else. And I think it allows people to like, again, introverts to be a bit more proactive in choosing a mate. there are
Yeah.
skills that are involved in the digital world that some people might find easier to access.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree with you on the community part. Because some of us live in bubbles almost of like all of our friends are LGBTQ, and like we just happen to meet people who are LGBTQ. And in that sense, it's a bit easier almost to meet people. And but I know someone who doesn't live in that bubble, and is finding it incredibly hard to even, like, first of all, come out to their friends, and second of all, if you can't come out to your friends, how are you going to meet new people in person? It's just because that is genuinely where he lives. It's just not really it's just not really feasible, and then so meeting new people online first, and getting to be able to dip your toes in, where the people around you probably aren't going to be that receptive to it, would be also a lot safer as well. Safer in a different way than I was talking about before, so that's really just, there's so many sides to this, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about people meeting at parks, for instance, like in terms of hookups. And we're talking about dating, and maybe you can use the term dating app to cover both like long-term dating, short-term dating, hookups, everything in between too. But gay men have been known for a long time to use that as an avenue to meet other gay men, and the reason really is because it's safe. Ironically, there's a safety component to it, right? You kind of know where to go to get what you need and who can give it to you. And if you're in a situation where you can't come out, you're not out yet, people assume, let's say, heteronormativity all around, then that's a different kind of level of safety, unsafety that we're talking about there. Yeah.
Yeah. So you also mentioned briefly at the beginning about the biggest misconception that you've heard about dating apps. Are there any others that you'd like to touch on?
Oh, right. Let's see. I think there's I've noticed in the stories that my clients tell, even in therapy, that there can be this shyness, maybe more than shyness, almost like embarrassment about meeting people online when they tell you, like, how did you guys meet? And it's like you have to come up with some story. And I find that that's probably influenced by some level of stigma and like general shame around that. That's really, and how you can tell if there's stigma and shame and like complex, as I would think of it, there is it lacks creativity. Right? So the story that's magical that people talk about, it's because of that kind of creativity that come with the magic of love. And I think people who have some shyness or embarrassment about it keeps them from telling a fuller story, because there's a story that you can tell that's still magical, and I've heard them and I've experienced them myself, and you might too, but you don't tend to hear it a whole lot. People tend to be more shy about that. But on the other side of things, people, let's say you meet somebody at a party or something, and there can be a lackluster kind of story there too when people tell it. So it really depends on like the state of consciousness, I think, of the person or something, rather than like the avenue itself.
Yeah, it probably also comes from this like preconceived notion that we kind of developed from early days of internet, where you meet someone online, meeting someone online meant that you had just a much higher chance of just meeting anyone that was physically attracted to you from the beginning. So it's not really a matter of happenstance. Whereas if you met in a bar at a party or something like that, that is like the magic of happenstance, and like, oh, we met by chance in love and all that kind of stuff. And that's so romantic. But definitely I feel like with dating apps, especially now that we've kind of like it's a bit more normalized than it was when it initially started, I feel like there's even more of like this, there isn't a chance that I'm going to match with this guy or this girl, or like there's less of a chance. Particularly also because there's so many features on dating apps now where it's like, oh, you can input what kind of relationship you're looking for, and with that you kind of get you have less of a chance of matching just with anyone, you probably only match with people that where they're looking for the same thing that you are. So it's probably that it probably was developed from that idea of like, or if you met this person on dating apps, it's just you could have matched with anyone, and that was just one of the hundreds you matched with.
I see. Well, what do you think about that?
Well, like, I don't necessarily agree with it. In fact, I don't agree with it at all. I personally, I met my partner on Hinge, a dating app, and I feel like it wasn't really this thing of like, oh, we're definitely going to match with each other. If anything, he looked at my profile and was like, oh, I don't know if this person's going to match with me at all, but I just have to like write this comment just so she knows. And whatever happens. Especially now that dating apps like Hinge kind of give you this space to show a bit more of your personality. There's less of a chance you're going to get like so many matches if you're being really specific about things. And I just feel like that's a very widespread just thing, like idea that we have in most people have ingrained in their brains. But yeah, I don't necessarily agree with it.
Well, what I think I heard in there is that the personality that you're saying, the space for the personality that something like Hinge provides, allowed room for your current partner, to also like extend his personality into it. Because when you said that, I don't know if this is going to work, but I still have to reply. Yeah. That to me is significant and meaningful and says something about the psychology of your partner. And that probably has an impact on you. And that's part of the magic, I think, that still exists in the digital world.
Yeah, because it's not just about like, it's not just about physical attraction anymore, especially with all of the features that, dating apps like Hinge provide now. It's more about like the personality, whether you're compatible. And of course, you're never going to fully know in the beginning, but the magic of it is you get a sense of who this person is. You feel like you could get to know them better and you feel something with them. And then there's not like a super high chance that you guys match, depending on like whatever the situation is. You don't know what's going on and you match with them, and then you have no idea you have no idea what's going to happen because you don't know this person, and you only really know these like little bits of details, and the magic is that it works out. Like what chance is like what are the chances of that, whereas if you also like whereas if you met in real life, let's say in school, and you took the same course, probably the chances are that your interests are similar because you're interested in studying the same thing.
I see.
So like, yes, there's like this rarity with that, but there's also rarity in meeting someone online on a dating app.
Well, it's cool that we're talking about seeing magic in different ways here, because I was just thinking another magic that you were talking about is the mystery itself, right? Like all the unknowns that can be magical. Can I share a story of like how it was magical for me? My last partner that I was with for a few years, we met. So the kind of magic that I experienced in the beginning was I had just worked through something internally with my therapist at the time, and the law of synchronicity. It's a theory from Carl Jung. It's when there's meaningful connection between the inner world and the outer world in some way. There's a symbol, let's say, that like you've been that captures sort of like the thing that you've been pondering. So a meaningful coincidence, right? And so I had just gone through something. And usually when something changes internally, it's almost like it manifests externally pretty almost instantaneously in my life. And so I had just like had a breakthrough of sorts in my therapy relationally. And a bunch of guys, and I've had these apps then for forever, and I would check them occasionally. And all of a sudden, pretty instantaneously, a bunch of guys popped up interested in me who are all the same type. And he was one of them. And I had thought, oh, well, this is interesting. It's been dry for a while, like why all of a sudden? And it was matching with something that I was working on internally in terms of meaningful coincidences. And then it narrowed down to him, my ex-partner, and another guy. And one really represented everything that was before the breakthrough. And then my partner that to be was everything that like I needed to like take a risk on to grow and to like expand myself and to feel a little vulnerable, the new path. And so I decided to go, with the one that would help assist with that. So that to me is magic right there.
Yeah. Yeah, that definitely is. Finding someone who happens to fit into the path that you want to take at the moment is definitely very much so magical. And yeah, it might be the same might apply for meeting people in real life. But I feel like the converse is rarely the consensus, if you will, and that's why there's a stigma there. But yeah, we've been talking a lot about what dating apps can offer and this like destigmatizing dating apps. But what are some challenges that do come to dating apps that might be unique to them, and how do you think we can navigate those?
We touched on it earlier with the projection. I think projections can be bigger, worse, darker on the online scene. People can be meaner, cyberbullying, all that kind of stuff exists. I think the dating app, social media world too. So I think that is the term, the shadow, again, comes from Jung psychology. That's something to really pay attention to, and your own shadow as well too. Now, I think the phenomenon of like ghosting is something that I think dating apps made popular in collective culture. Like that can happen for sure, and like haters and bullies, but also ghosting, and people are probably chatting with a whole lot of other people. So I think the presence that you might expect of meeting somebody at a bar and you go into a corner and you have a conversation for the rest of the night will be different.
Yeah, for sure. And so with that, I feel like there needs to be dating app etiquette or decorum, if you will, that might not necessarily be like made known to the masses in, who knows, the next year or so, depending on how widespread dating apps become. Well, it's already widespread, but it depends on how like people want to take the dating apps, like how seriously they want to take it. Do they want to treat it like they really are just digital assets, or do they want to treat it like they're actually real people? But let's talk dating app decorum. What are some guidelines that you think could help produce a better online dating experience for people?
Well, remembering that they're real people, which is what you just had ended with there. I think, these avatars, it's easy. Part of the reason I think the projection is so easy is because we forget that there are real people with real feelings behind them, and that words still count and hit and matter. The term persona, another term from Jung psychology, is a Greek word for a mask that an actor wears. And we have different personae in different social settings. And it's adaptive. And it's a part of the ego, what our awareness, it's part of its crafting, There's a craftiness, I think, to it. So I think, like other social media, dating apps is a social media, and that it is a persona that we're putting out there as well. So keep that in mind. Who you show up as in this realm will be who you will attract and encounter. And also like think again, the more mainstream ones like LinkedIn and Instagram, now people they're not so stigmatized, let's say, right, as some of the other ones. Who are the audience? So this would be your audience of who you would like to attract for what purposes. So kind of craft the persona around those awarenesses.
You also did mention previously that sometimes there is this expectation of like what a person is, this idea of what a person is when you're meeting them virtually. So when it comes to dating apps, what is something that we can do to kind of circumvent that or kind of manage our expectations of what someone is?
Oh. Well, the whole projection concept, I think, is helpful because it means that it's a split off part of your own self that you're less aware of, right? Less inclined to be aware of and have maybe strong feelings about, really love, really hate, that kind of thing. So I think just the awareness that projections is going to happen might help in and of itself, just that consciousness. I think another thing to keep in mind, in addition to everything that we've talked about already, would be those golden rules. You know, like how would you like to be treated? Is that would that feel good to hear? You know, and why would you put that out there into the world? And show up knowing that they're real people, you know, that are out there, but that show up as a real person too. I think that will help.
Yeah. And when do you think is an appropriate time to connect with someone that you've matched with on social media?
I usually think as soon as possible. I mean, the point is to get to know someone and to get to know them, go on dates. It's like you know someone. But I know some people who will take forever, who take their sweet time before they will meet somebody in person. I don't recommend that. So I would say as soon as possible.
Yeah, I guess it kind of depends on the person you're talking to. Like you've got to, like, I think in real life, when you're socializing in real life, there is this like self-awareness or just general awareness of like who you're talking to and kind of getting a feel for what they are like, and then so you kind of make them feel safe, right? And then so if they aren't social media people or they don't want to necessarily link up on social media until a later date, you kind of get a feel for that. And I think the same thing applies probably to dating apps. If someone's precious about it, then you kind of just okay, maybe you're okay with linking up with someone on social media immediately, but then it's kind of getting a feel for what the person you're talking to might be comfortable with. And I think that is probably this like similar to, you know, that thing you said earlier about projecting and just kind of thinking what this person would be okay with, or, you know, what this person would like to hear, something like that. So yeah, with all of these, yeah.
Well, just real quick, I had another thought about like people sometimes will say in my consulting room that the person didn't look the same. You know, there's always that issue, or their personality was so different than from the online chat. And so I think to circumvent some of that, it would be meet sooner than later. That's why I had set that in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that can happen.
Oh yeah, for sure. Oh man, there's so many things to think about and consider when dating on like meeting people through dating apps. But is there anything else that you think people should know or consider before using dating apps to get into relationships or meeting new people?
I think ultimately it's about meeting people and purposes of that, which is to connect on some level, whether it's just a one-night stand connection or a longer-term connection where you buy a house and have kids together. I think it boils down to that, because a lot of the times, again, with the projections and things, people, you know, our complexes can get played out. We want flattery and attention, for instance, and people will go to dating apps, social media for that. And I think sometimes you can flirt for flirting's sake too. But again, there's an ethics of engagement. If there's a kind of like, if you have a sense, let's say that, the person is wanting more and you're like lying on purpose, to fish out compliments for a few more weeks, kind of check that.
Yeah. That's really, really good advice. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. It was such an insightful conversation. But before we move on to the next section, I wanted to also ask you if you had any advice at all for crafting what people would consider a good profile.
Well, in terms of a dating like app, I think it depends on what your purposes are, right? Short-term relationship, long-term relationship, hookup, short-term hookup, long-term hookup. I usually say have something like kind of our screenshots here, which is like, this profile, not profile, but like from the chest up. And then if you're talking about like romantic sexual relationships, you might want to capture the rest of you as well. And do it more, keep it up to date. Don't use a picture from 2 decades ago. So be real.
Yeah, 100%. That probably also goes the same for like any type of prompt that the dating apps might have. Like maybe update that as you go along. If it's already been a few months and not really connecting with the prompt or the answer that you gave the prompt, maybe it's time to change it, and that will give the person a better feel for what kind of space you're in. So yeah, that was really, really great advice. Thank you so much for sharing. Now we're moving on to the practices and habits section. And my first question for you, now we want to hear from your experience. What habits do you practice, or what habits would you recommend our listeners to do to maintain healthy expectations when using dating apps?
Well, one would be to take a break from time to time. If you're feeling like putting a whole lot of energy into something that isn't paying off, that kind of energy, sometimes a little bit of a reset can be helpful, a little reboot. And just know that with these dating apps, you can always like, freeze your profile, completely take it off, and there's all kinds of functions. But do that, but if you just delete it from your phone, the profile is probably still there. So that's a practice that I definitely recommend. Another one is that, with all these projections and things, find a good therapist if you don't have one. Like do some self-reflective practice, journaling, and reminding yourself of like what are the purposes of me going down this avenue. Sometimes people can get lost.
Yeah.
And certainly with romantic relationships, people do get lost, and we seek a certain amount of getting lost, but maybe not that early in the game.
Could you give me some comfort when it comes to the therapist thing? Because when I was dating a lot and I went to my therapist and I had so many things going on in my dating life that I had to process and tell my therapist about, I sometimes felt like, this therapist doesn't want to, like, this therapist must be hearing about my issues or like my happenings in my life and going like, oh, that's really stupid, or like this is really like a bunch of nonsense at this point. What, as a therapist, what do you think therapists usually feel with that?
Well, I will respect your question and answer it, but I think it's kind of asking the wrong question. So be honest. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, I just want to hear that like I'm not wasting my therapist's time.
Oh.
Well,
speaking of projection, I would say that could be a projection. And if it's a therapeutic relation, actually any relationship really where you feel like you can talk to the person and process, I would bring it up as a feeling. Like I'm having these feelings and just check.
Yeah. Instead of like, oh my God, this happened again.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Now I know how to approach things in therapy. I think sometimes, like, I don't know if anyone else does this, but sometimes I go to therapy being like, oh my God, this happened again. And let me tell you what else. I'll spill all the tea as a way to, like, you know, it's like a defense mechanism.
Whose defense mechanism? The client's?
Mine. Yeah. You know,
I'm
do you
talking
know
about
what
the
I
same
mean?
thing over and over and over. Well, that's the nature of therapy, though, is like you kind of like circle a similar themes over and over and over again. The point would be, you know, you kind of like learn a little different, or it's more of a spiral than a circle is the metaphor that I like to think of. So.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And I will be approaching therapy a bit different now. Well, like, here's the thing. I'm not dating anymore. So like I can't really but I'll apply this to like future events. If I ever feel like going to my therapist and being like, oh my God, guess what happened? Yeah, I'll take note of that. Thank you very much for advice. Now we're moving on to the open mic section. This is your chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Well, along the themes of today, because I like to stick to themes, I think when we talk about dating apps, romantic relationships, sexuality, I think vulnerability is really key. And oftentimes, especially with like a dating app persona, we like to put the best out there, right? Like the ones where we have like the most muscles or whatever else, the most flattering pictures or angles. And really it's like letting your partner into your insecurities is what's going to hit the good stuff. And like having them hold it gently and lovingly and them sharing theirs with you. I mean, that's the stuff. And I think one way to get a little bit deeper or realer sooner is just put it out, take the risk of putting out these things sooner. And, you know, that comes down to like your darkest fantasies, you know, like, or being conscientious of like the kind of performativeness that you can get into, for instance, and just check that, or just even name it when you're with your partner, because you're probably feeling something similar too. And then that could create an opportunity to connect and relate over something like, oh, well, we both feel more performative, you know, in bed. How can we, you know, navigate that together? So vulnerability is always key. And that doesn't mean, you know, like on these dating apps, like pour your heart out, because I think that's something like a not a very adaptive persona or something, because you kind of, you know, want to know the audience as well, and in the context of your relationship too, right? And so, but I think err on the side of vulnerability and do it sooner.
Yeah, for sure. I really liked what you said, especially with, you know, opening up with your partner and being more vulnerable, even if you don't necessarily agree on certain things. If you're more vulnerable, at least it means, you know, that they know where you're at on this certain, for example, like topic or certain thing. And that kind of creates this little space and kind of privacy, or like, I don't know how to explain it, kind of like a sacredness, if you will, where you both like know this about each other and you're going through this together, and you and then there's also like with on the dating apps, you know, there's a difference between being vulnerable and just straight up oversharing, which is something to keep in mind. It's always good to be vulnerable, but then, you know, when you're just like oversharing on your trauma all the time, when people aren't really quite ready or there yet, there's a difference. So but what do you think about that?
The last part where the trauma dumping and oversharing. Well, I so caveated by saying that it's never super literal, but I always think that whatever a person says is revealing something about the person. Right? And so if you're on there complaining about, you know, your exes and just ranting about your exes or something, then it's like, well, you may not have fully processed and, you know, integrated that experience. you might be dating the same person over and over and over again, is what it sounds like. For instance, just the profiles I've read through the years or something. I think that with the vulnerability, there's got to be an aspect that feels like you have to muster up a little bit of courage, though. So if you're just trauma dumping, I don't think people who trauma dump are feeling vulnerable in the way that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something else being accessed there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that with us and for giving us advice on how to create a good profile for destigmatizing the dating app world with us. So if our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Well, my website is entheopsychotherapy.com, entheo, E-N-T-H-E-O, like God within, inspire the God within, psychotherapy.com.
That's such
and I'm
a
a
nice
digital
name.
nomad. Thank you. And I'm a digital nomad, so you can't really reach me by like a phone number, but there's all kinds of ways to hit me up and chat and email and things.
Amazing. We'll link that in the show notes. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope you learned something about dating apps and how to navigate that. We will catch you in the next episode.
You've been listening to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. For more episodes like this from 10 different life management perspectives, search LMSL on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, so you can get updated on everything we have to offer. We have a wide range of topics readily available for you to check out. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps us grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at re.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.